Hello from Mississippi, halfway between Tupelo and the Alabama state line. This is the birth of Biopolitics, lectures by Michel Foucault in 1978-79 at the College of France. This is the third lecture given on the 24th of January 1979. Last week I tried to clarify what seemed to me to be some of the basic characteristics of the liberal art of government. First of all, I spoke about the problem of economic truth and of the truth of the market, and then of the problem of the limitation of governmentality by the calculus of utility. I would like now to deal with a third aspect, which I think is also fundamental, that of international equilibriums, or Europe and the international space in liberalism. You remember that when last year we talked about raison d'etat, I tried to show you that there was a kind of equilibrium, a system of counterweights between what could be called unlimited objectives within the state on the one hand, and limited external objectives on the other. The unlimited objectives within the state were pursued through the mechanism of the police state. That is to say, an always more emphatic, accentuated, fine, and subtle governmentality of regimentation with no predetermined limits. So, internally, there were unlimited objectives, and then limited objectives externally, in as much as at the same time as the formation of raison d'etat and the organization of the police state was taking place, there was also the pursuit and real organization of what is called European balance, the principle of which is the following: to see to it that no state prevails over the others, so as to reconstitute imperial unity in Europe, to see to it, consequently, that no state dominates all the others, or prevails over its neighbors to such an extent that it can dominate them, etc. It is quite easy to see and understand the connection between these two mechanisms of unlimited objectives with the police state and limited objectives with European balance, in as much as if the raison d'etre, purpose, and objective of the police state or of the internal mechanisms which endlessly organize and develop the police state is the strengthening of the state itself. Then the target of each state is to strengthen itself endlessly. That is to say, its aim is an unlimited increase of its power in relation to the others. In clear terms, competition to be the best in this competitive game will introduce into Europe a number of inequalities which will increase, which will be sanctioned by an imbalance in the population and consequently in military strength. And you will end up with the well-known imperial situation from which European balance, since the Treaty of Westphalia, wished to free Europe. The balance was established to avoid this situation. More precisely, in mercantilist calculation and in the way in which mercantilism organizes the economic, political calculation of forces, it is clear that a European equilibrium is actually unavoidable if you want to prevent the realization of a new imperial configuration. For mercantilism, competition between states assumes that everything by which one state is enriched can, and in truth must, be deducted from the wealth of other states. What one state acquires must be taken from the other. One can only enrich itself at the cost of the others. In other words, what I think is important is that for the mercantilists, the economic game is a zero-sum game. It is a zero-sum game quite simply because of the monetarist conception and practice of mercantilism. There is a certain amount of gold in the world. Since gold defines, measures, and constitutes the wealth of each state, it is understood that whenever one state gets richer, it will take from the common stock of gold and consequently impoverish the others. The monetarist character of mercantilist policy and calculation consequently entails that competition can only be conceived in the form of a zero-sum game, and so of the enrichment of some at the expense of others. To avoid the phenomenon of having one and only one winner in this zero-sum game, to avoid this political consequence of competition thus defined. Strict economic logic requires the establishment of something like an equilibrium which will allow the game to be interrupted, as it were, at a given moment. That is to say, the game will be halted when there is a danger of the difference between the players becoming too great. And it is precisely in this that European equilibrium consists. This is exactly, well, up to a point, Pascal's problem. In a zero-sum game, what happens when you interrupt the game and divide out the winnings between the players? Interrupting the game of competition with the diplomacy of equilibrium is necessarily entailed by the monetarist conception and practice of the mercantilists. This is the starting point. Now, what happens in the middle of the 18th century, in that period I have talked about and tried to locate the formation of a new governmental reason? Things will, of course, be completely different in this new raison d'etat, or in this new reason of the least state, which finds the core of its veridiction in the market and its de facto jurisdiction in utility. In fact, for the physiocrats, but also for Adam Smith, the freedom of the market can and must function in such a way that what they call the natural price or the good price will be established through and thanks to this freedom. Anyway, this natural price or good price is such that it must always be profitable to whom? It will be profitable to the seller, but also to the buyer, to both buyer and seller. That is to say, the beneficial effects of competition will not be divided unequally between them and necessarily to the advantage of one at the expense of the other. The legitimate game of natural competition, that is to say, competition under conditions of freedom, can only lead to a dual profit. The fluctuation of the price around the value, which last week I showed that according to the physiocrats, and Adam Smith was assured by the freedom of the market, brings into play a mechanism of mutual enrichment, maximum profit for the seller, minimum expense for the buyers. So we find this idea, which will be at the center of the economic game as defined by the liberals. That actually the enrichment of one country, like the enrichment of one individual, can only really be established and maintained in the long term by a mutual enrichment. My neighbor's wealth is important for my own enrichment, and not in the sense that the mercantilists said, my neighbor must possess gold in order to buy my products, which will enable me to impoverish him by enriching myself. My neighbor must be rich, and he will be rich to the same extent as I enrich myself through my commerce and our mutual commerce. Consequently, there is a correlative enrichment, an enrichment en bloc, a regional enrichment. Either the whole of Europe will be rich, or the whole of Europe will be poor. There is no longer any cake to be divided up. We enter an age of an economic historicity governed by, if not unlimited enrichment, then at least reciprocal enrichment through the game of competition. I think something very important begins to take shape here, the consequences of which are, as you know, far from being exhausted. What is taking shape is a new idea of Europe that is not at all the imperial and Carolingian Europe more or less inherited from the Roman Empire, in referring to quite specific political structures. Nor is it any longer the classical Europe of balance, of an equilibrium between forces established in such a way that the force of one never prevails too decisively over the other. It is a Europe of collective enrichment, Europe as a collective subject that, whatever the competition between states, or rather through the competition between states, has to advance in the form of unlimited economic progress. This idea of progress, of a European progress, is a fundamental theme in liberalism and completely overturns the themes of European equilibrium, even though these themes do not disappear completely. With this conception of the physiocrats and Adam Smith, we leave behind a conception of the economic game as a zero-sum game. But if it is no longer to be a zero-sum game, then permanent and continuous inputs are still necessary. In other words, if freedom of the market must ensure the reciprocal, correlative, and more or less simultaneous enrichment of all the countries of Europe, for this to function and for freedom of the market to thus unfold according to a game that is not a zero-sum game, then it is necessary to summon around Europe and for Europe an increasingly extended market, and even if it comes to it, everything in the world that can be put on the market. In other words, we are invited to a globalization of the market when it is laid down as a principle and an objective that the enrichment of Europe must be brought about as a collective and unlimited enrichment, and not through the enrichment of some and the impoverishment of others. The unlimited character of the economic development of Europe and the consequent existence of a non-zero-sum game entails, of course, that the whole world is summoned around Europe to exchange its own and Europe's products in the European market. Of course, I do not mean that this is the first time that Europe thinks about the world or thinks the world. I mean simply that this may be the first time that Europe appears as an economic unit, as an economic subject in the world, or considers the world as able to be and having to be its economic domain. It seems to me that it is the first time that Europe appears in its own eyes as having to have the world for its unlimited market. Europe is no longer merely covetous of all the world's riches that sparkle in its dreams or perceptions. Europe is now in a state of permanent and collective enrichment through its own competition, on condition that the entire world becomes its market. In short, in the time of mercantilism, raison d'etat, and the police state, etc., the calculation of a European balance enabled one to block the consequences of an economic game conceived as being over. Now, the opening up of a world market allows one to continue the economic game, and consequently to avoid the conflicts which derive from a finite market. But this opening of the economic game onto the world clearly implies a difference of both kind and status between Europe and the rest of the world. That is to say, there will be Europe on one side with Europeans as the players, and then the world on the other, which will be the stake. The game is in Europe, but the stake is in the world. It seems to me that we have in this one of the fundamental features of this new art of government that is indexed to the problem of the market and market veridiction. Obviously, this organization, or at any rate this reflection on the reciprocal positions of Europe and the world, is not the start of colonization. Colonization had long been underway, nor do I think this is the start of imperialism in the modern or contemporary sense of the term. My ice cube won't melt. Okay, here we go. For we probably see the formation of this new imperialism later in the 19th century. But let's say that we have the start of a new type of global calculation in European governmental practice. I think there are many signs of this appearance of a new form of global rationality, of a new calculation on the scale of the world. I will refer to just some of these. Take, for example, the history of maritime law in the 18th century, and the way in which, in terms of international law, there was an attempt to think of the world, or at least the sea, as a space of free competition, of free maritime circulation, and consequently, as one of the necessary conditions for the organization of a world market. The history of piracy, the way in which it was at once used, encouraged, combated, and suppressed, etc., could also figure as one of the aspects of this elaboration of a worldwide space in terms of a number of legal principles. We can say that there was a juridification of the world which should be thought of in terms of the organization of a market. Yet another example of this appearance of a governmental rationality that has the entire planet for its horizon is the 18th century projects for peace and international organization. If you consider those that existed in the 17th century, you will see that these projects for peace were essentially based on European equilibrium. That is to say, on the exact balance of reciprocal forces between different states, between the different powerful states, or between different coalitions of states, or between the powerful states and a coalition of the smaller states, and so on. From the 18th century, the idea of perpetual peace and the idea of international organization are, I think, articulated completely differently. It is no longer so much the limitation of internal forces that is called upon to guarantee and found a perpetual peace, but rather the unlimited nature of the external market. The larger the external market, the fewer its borders and limits, the more you will have a guarantee of perpetual peace. If you take Kant's text on the project of perpetual peace, for example, which dates from 1795, right at the end of the 18th century, there is a chapter entitled on the guarantee of perpetual peace. How does Kant conceive of this perpetual peace? He says, what fundamentally is it in history that guarantees this perpetual peace and promises us that one day it really will take shape and form in history. Is it men's will and their mutual understanding? The political and diplomatic devices that they will have been able to construct? Or the organization of rights that they will have been able to install between them? Not at all. It is nature. Just as in the physiocrats, it was nature that guaranteed the good regulation of the market. And how does nature guarantee perpetual peace? It is very simple. Kant says, nature, after all, has done some absolutely marvelous things, since it has managed, for example, to get not only animals, but even peoples to live in lands completely scorched by the sun or frozen by eternal sheets of ice. There are people who manage to live there in spite of everything, which proves that there is nowhere in the world where human beings cannot live. But for people to be able to live, they must be able to feed themselves, to produce their food, have a social organization, and exchange their products between themselves or with people from other regions. Nature intended the entire world, the whole of its surface, to be given over to the economic activity of production and exchange. And on that basis, nature has prescribed a number of obligations that are juridical obligations for man, but which nature has in a way dictated to him secretly, which she has, as it were, marked out in the very arrangement of things, of geography, the climate, and so on. What are these arrangements? First, that men can have relations of exchange with each other individually, supported by property, etc. And this prescription or precept of nature will be taken up in legal obligations and become civil law. Second, nature determined that men be distributed across the world in distinct regions, and that within each of these regions they have privileged relationships with each other that they do not have with the inhabitants of other regions. And men have taken up this precept in legal terms by forming separate states which maintain certain legal relationships between them. This will become international law. But in addition, nature has wished that there are not only juridical relationships between these states, guaranteeing their independence, but also commercial relationships that cross the borders between states and consequently make the juridical independence of each state porous, as it were. Commercial relationships cross the world, just as nature intended, and to the same extent as nature intended the whole world to be populated. And this will constitute cosmopolitan law or commercial law. this edifice of civil law, international law, and cosmopolitan law is nothing other than man's taking up of a precept of nature as obligations. So we can say that law, inasmuch as it resumes the precept of nature, will be able to promise what was in a way already outlined in the first action of nature when it populated the entire world. Something like perpetual peace. Perpetual peace is guaranteed by nature, and this guarantee is manifested in the population of the entire world and in the commercial relationships stretching across the whole world. The guarantee of perpetual peace is therefore actually commercial globalization. A number of things should no doubt be added to this, but in any case, I should answer an objection straight away. When I say that a new form of political calculation on an international scale emerges in the thought of the physiocrats, Adam Smith, of Kant too, and of 18th century jurists, I do not in any way mean that every other form of reflection, calculation, and analysis, that every other governmental practice disappears. For if it is true that something like a worldwide global market is discovered in this period, if at this moment the privileged position of Europe in relation to the world is asserted, and if it is also asserted at this time that competition between European states is a factor in their common enrichment, this does not mean, of course, all history proves, that we enter into a period of European peace and the peaceful globalization of politics. In fact, with the 19th century, we enter the worst period of customs barriers, forms of economic protectionism, of national economies, and political nationalism, and the biggest wars the world has ever known. What I wanted to show you was simply that a particular form of reflection, analysis, and calculation appeared at this time, which is integrated, as it were, into political practices that may perfectly well conform to a different type of calculation, a different system of thought, and a different practice of power. we would only have to look at what happened at the Congress of Vienna, for example. It could be said that this is the most striking manifestation of what was sought after in the 17th and 18th centuries, namely a European balance. What were its concerns, in fact? Its task was to put an end to what appeared to be the resurrection of the imperial idea with Napoleon. Because the historical paradox of Napoleon is that at the level of internal policy, he was manifestly hostile to the idea of a police state. And his problem was really how to limit governmental practice internally. And this is clear from his interventions in the Council of State and the way in which he reflected on his own governmental practice. On the other hand, we can say that Napoleon was completely archaic in his external policy, in as much as he wanted to reconstitute something like the imperial configuration against which the whole of Europe had been ranked since the 17th century. In truth, Napoleon's imperial idea, so far as it can be reconstructed, in spite of the astounding silence of historians on this theme, seems to have corresponded to three objectives. First, and I think I talked about this last year, okay, again, Napoleon's imperial idea, so far as it can be reconstructed, in spite of the astounding silence of historians on this theme, seems to have corresponded to three objectives. Okay, first, and I think I talked about this last year, if we go by what the historians and jurists of the 18th century said about the Carolingian Empire, in terms of internal policy, the empire guaranteed freedoms. In its opposition to the monarchy, the empire did not represent more power, but rather less power and less governmentality. On the other hand, and probably on the basis of the limitlessness of the revolutionary objectives, that is to say, to revolutionize the whole world, the empire was a way of taking up the revolutionary project that erupted in France in 1792 and 93, and of taking it up in the then archaic idea of imperial domination inherited from the Carolingian forms, or from the form of the Holy Roman Empire. This mixture of the idea of an empire which internally guarantees freedoms of an empire, which will give a European form to the unlimited revolutionary project, and finally of an empire which will reconstitute the Carolingian or German or Austrian form of empire, made up the hodgepodge of Napoleon's imperial politics. The problem of the Congress of Vienna was, of course, to close off, as it were, that imperial limitlessness. It was, of course, to reestablish the equilibrium of Europe, but basically with two different objectives. The Austrian objective and the English objective. The Austrian objective was to reconstitute a European equilibrium in the old form of the 17th and 18th centuries, ensuring that no country can prevail over the others in Europe. Austria was absolutely tied to this kind of project, in as much as it only had an administrative government, being made up of a number of different states and only organizing these in the form of the old police state. This plurality of police states at the heart of Europe meant that Europe itself was basically modeled on this old schema of a balanced multiplicity of police states. Europe had to be in the image of Austria for Austria to remain as it was. To that extent, we can say that for Metternich, the calculation of European equilibrium was still and remained that of the 18th century. On the other hand, what kind of equilibrium was sought by England and imposed together with Austria at the Congress of Vienna? It was a way of regionalizing Europe, of limiting, of course, the power of each of the European states, but so as to allow England a political and economic role as economic mediator between Europe and the world market, so as to globalize the European economy through mediation. The relay of England's economic power. So we have here a completely different calculation of European equilibrium founded on the principle of Europe as a particular economic region faced with or within a world that must become its market. The calculation of European equilibrium for Austria at the Congress of Vienna is completely different. So you can see that within a single historical reality, you may very well find two entirely different types of rationality and political calculation. I will stop these speculations here, and before moving on to the analysis of present-day liberalism in Germany and America, I would like to summarize a little what I have said about these fundamental features of liberalism, or at any rate of an art of government which emerges in the 18th century. So I have tried to indicate three features: veridiction of the market, limitation by the calculation of governmental utility, and now the position of Europe as a region of unlimited economic development in relation to a world market. This is what I have called liberalism. Why speak of liberalism? And why speak of a liberal art of government when it is quite clear that the things I have referred to and the features I have tried to indicate basically point to a much more general phenomenon than the pure and simple economic doctrine or the pure and simple political doctrine or the pure and simple economic political choice of liberalism in the strict sense. If we take things up a bit further back, if we take them up at their origin, you can see that what characterizes this new art of government I have spoken about would be much more a naturalism than liberalism, inasmuch as the freedom that the physiocrats and Adam Smith talk about is much more the spontaneity, the internal and intrinsic mechanics of economic processes than a juridical freedom of the individual recognized as such. Even in Kant, who is much more a jurist than an economist, you have seen that perpetual peace is not guaranteed by law, but by nature. In actual fact, it is something like a governmental naturalism which emerges in the middle of the 18th century. And yet, I think we can speak of liberalism. I could also tell you, but I will come back to this, that this naturalism, which I think is fundamental, or at any rate original in this art of government, appears very clearly in the physiocratic conception of enlightened despotism. I will come back to this at greater length, but in a few words, what conclusions do the physiocrats draw from their discovery of the existence of spontaneous mechanisms of the economy which must be respected by every government if It does not want to induce effects counter to or even the opposite of its objectives. Is it that people must be given the freedom to act as they wish? Is it that governments must recognize the essential, basic, natural rights of individuals? Is it that government must be as little authoritarian as possible? It is none of these things. What the physiocrats deduce from their discovery is that the government must know these mechanisms in their innermost and complex nature. Once it knows these mechanisms, it must, of course, undertake to respect them. But this does not mean that it provide itself with a juridical framework respecting individual freedoms and the basic rights of individuals. It means simply that it arm its politics with a precise, continuous, clear, and distinct knowledge of what is taking place in society, in the market, and in the economic circuits, so that the limitation of its power is not given by respect for the freedom of individuals, but simply by the evidence of economic analysis, which it knows has to be respected. It is limited by evidence, not by the freedom of individuals. So, what we see appearing in the middle of the 18th century really is a naturalism much more than a liberalism. Nevertheless, I think we can employ the word liberalism in as much as freedom really is at the heart of this practice, or of the problems it confronts. Actually, I think we should be clear that when we speak of liberalism with regard to this new art of government, this does not mean that we are passing from an authoritarian government in the 17th century and at the start of the 18th century to a government which becomes more tolerant, more lax, and more flexible. I do not want to say that this is not the case, but neither do I want to say that it is. It does not seem to me that a proposition like that has much historical or political meaning. I did not want to say that there was a quantitative increase of freedom between the start of the 18th century and, let's say, the 19th century. I have not said this for two reasons. One is factual, and the other is a reason of method and principle. The factual reason, first of all. What sense is there in saying, or simply wondering, if an administrative monarchy like that of France in the 17th and 18th centuries, with all its big, heavy, unwieldy, and inflexible machinery, with its statutory privileges, which had to be recognized, with the arbitrariness of decisions left to different people, and with all the shortcomings of its instruments, allowed more or less freedom than a regime which is liberal, let's say, but which takes on the task of continuously and effectively taking charge of individuals and their well-being, health and work, their way of being, behaving, and even dying, etc. So, comparing the quantity of freedom between one system and another does not, in fact, have much sense. And we do not see what type of demonstration, what type of gauge or measure we could apply. This leads us to the second reason, which seems to me to be more fundamental. This is that we should not think of freedom as a universal which is gradually realized over time, or which undergoes quantitative variations, greater or lesser drastic reductions, or more or less important periods of eclipse. It is not a universal which is particularized in time and geography. Freedom is not a white surface with more or less numerous black spaces here and there from time to time. Freedom is never anything other, but this is already a great deal, than an actual relation between governors and governed. A relation in which the measure of the too little existing freedom is given by the even more freedom demanded. So when I say liberal, I am not pointing to a form of governmentality which would leave more white spaces of freedom. I mean something else. If I employ the word liberal, if I employ the word liberal, it is first of all because this governmental practice, in the process of establishing itself, is not satisfied with respecting this or that freedom. with guaranteeing this or that freedom. More profoundly, it is a consumer of freedom. It is a consumer of freedom inasmuch as it can only function in so far as a number of freedoms actually exist. Freedom of the market, freedom to buy and sell, the free exercise of property rights, freedom of discussion, possible freedom of expression, and so on. The new governmental reason needs freedom, therefore. The new art of government consumes freedom. It consumes freedom, which means that it must produce it. It must produce it. It must organize it. The new art of government therefore appears as the management of freedom, not in the sense of the imperative, be free, with the immediate contradiction that this imperative may contain. The formula of liberalism is not be free. Liberalism formulates simply the following: liberalism formulates simply the following: I am going to produce what you need to be free. I am going to see to it that you are free to be free. And so, if this liberalism is not so much the imperative of freedom as the management and organization of the conditions in which one can be free, it is clear that at the heart of this liberal practice is an always different and mobile, problematic relationship between the production of freedom and that which in the production of freedom risks limiting and destroying it. Liberalism, as I understand it, the liberalism we can describe as the art of government formed in the 18th century, entails at its heart a productive / destructive relationship with freedom. Liberalism must produce freedom, but this very act entails the establishment of limitations, controls, forms of coercion, and obligations relying on threats, etc. Clearly, we have examples of this. There must be free trade, of course, but how can we practice free trade? In fact, if we do not control and limit a number of things, and if we do not organize a series of preventive measures to avoid the effects of one country's hegemony over others, which would be precisely the limitation and restriction of free trades. All the European countries and the United States encounter this paradox from the start of the 19th century when, convinced by the economists of the end of the 18th century, those in power who want to establish the order of commercial freedom come up against British hegemony. American governments, for example, who used this problem of free trade as a reason for revolt against England, established protectionist tariffs from the start of the 19th century in order to save a free trade that would be compromised by English hegemony. Similarly, there must be freedom of the internal market, of course, but again, for there to be a market, there must be buyers as well as sellers. Consequently, if necessary, the market must be supported and buyers created by mechanisms of assistance. For freedom of the internal market to exist, the effects of monopolies must be prevented. And so, anti-monopoly legislation is needed. There must be a free labor market. But again, there must be a large enough number of sufficiently competent, qualified, and politically disarmed workers to prevent them exerting pressure on the labor market. We have then the conditions for the creation for a formidable body of legislation and an incredible range of governmental interventions to guarantee production of the freedom needed in order to govern. Broadly speaking, in the liberal regime, in the liberal art of government, freedom of behavior is entailed. Freedom of behavior is entailed. Broadly speaking, in the liberal regime, in the liberal art of government, freedom of behavior is entailed, called for, needed, and serves as a regulator. but it also has to be produced and organized. So, freedom in the regime of liberalism is not a given. It is not a ready-made region which has to be respected. Or if it is not so only partially. It is so only partially, regionally, in this or that case, etc. Freedom is something which is constantly produced. Liberalism is not acceptance of freedom. It proposes to manufacture it constantly, to arouse it and produce it with, of course, the system of constraints and the problems of cost raised by this production. What, then, will be the principle of calculation for this cost of manufacturing freedom? The principle of calculation is what is called security. That is to say, liberalism, the liberal art of government, is forced to determine the precise extent to which and up to what point individual interest, that is to say, individual interests in so far as they are different and possibly opposed to each other, constitute a danger for the interest of all. The problem of security is the protection of the collective interest against individual interests. Conversely, individual interests have to be protected against everything that could be seen as an encroachment of the collective interest. Again, the freedom of economic processes must not be a danger. Either for enterprises or for workers. The freedom of the workers must not become a danger for the enterprise and production. Individual accidents and events in an individual's life, such as illness or inevitable old age, must not be a danger, either for individuals or for society. In short, strategies of security, which are, in a way, both liberalism's other face and its very condition, must correspond to all these imperatives concerning the need to ensure that the mechanism of interests does not give rise to individual or collective dangers. the game of freedom and security is at the very heart of this new governmental reason, whose general characteristics I have tried to describe. The problems of what I shall call the economy of power peculiar to liberalism are internally sustained, as it were, by this interplay of freedom and security. Broadly speaking, in the old political system of sovereignty, there was a set of legal and economic relations between the sovereign and the subject, which committed and even obliged the sovereign to protect the subject. But this protection was, in a way, external. The subject could demand the protection of his sovereign against an external or internal enemy. It is completely different in the case of liberalism. It is no longer just that kind of external protection of the individual himself which must be assured. Liberalism turns into a mechanism continually having to arbitrate between the freedom and security of individuals by reference to this notion of danger. Basically, if one side, and this is what I said last week, liberalism is an art of government that fundamentally deals with interests. It cannot do this, and this is the other side of the coin, without at the same time managing the dangers and mechanisms of security/freedom. The interplay of security/freedom, which must ensure that individuals or the community have the least exposure to danger. A number of consequences follow from this. First, we can say that the motto of liberalism is live dangerously. Live dangerously, that is to say, individuals are constantly exposed to danger, or rather, they are conditioned to experience their situation, their life, their present, and their future as containing danger. I think this kind of stimulus, of danger, will be one of the major implications of liberalism. An entire education and culture of danger appears in the 19th century, which is very different from those great apocalyptic threats of plague, death, and war, which fed the political and cosmological imagination of the Middle Ages and even of the 17th century. The horsemen of the apocalypse disappear, and in their place, everyday dangers appear, emerge, and spread everywhere, perpetually being brought to life, reactualized and circulated by what could be called the political culture of danger in the 19th century. This political culture of danger has a number of aspects. For example, there is the campaign for savings banks at the start of the 19th century. You see the appearance of detective fiction and journalistic interest in crime around the middle of the 19th century. There are the campaigns around disease and hygiene. And then think too of what took place with regard to sexuality and the fear of degeneration. Degeneration of the individual, the family, the race, and the human species. In short, everywhere you see this stimulation of the fear of danger, which is, as it were, the condition, the internal, psychological, and cultural correlative of liberalism. There is no liberalism without a culture of danger. The second consequence of this liberalism in liberal art of government is the considerable extension of procedures of control, constraint, and coercion, which are something like the counterpart and counterweights of different freedoms. I have drawn attention to the fact that the development, dramatic rise in dissemination throughout society of these famous disciplinary techniques for taking charge of the behavior of individuals day by day. And in its fine detail is exactly contemporaneous with the age of freedoms. Economic freedom. Liberalism in the sense I have just been talking about. Economic freedom. Liberalism in the sense I have just been talking about. And disciplinary techniques are completely bound up with each other. At the beginning of his career, or around 1792 through 95, Bentham presented the famous panopticon as a procedure for institutions like schools, factories, and prisons, which would enable one to supervise the conduct of individuals while increasing the profitability and productivity of their activity. At the end of his life, in his project of the general codification of English legislation, Bentham will propose that the panopticon should be the formula for the whole of the government, saying that the panopticon is the very formula of liberal government. What basically must a government do? It must give way to everything due to natural mechanisms in both behavior and production. It must give way to these mechanisms and make no other intervention, to start with at least, than that of supervision. Government, initially limited to the function of supervision, is only to intervene when it sees that something is not happening according to the general mechanics of behavior, exchange, and economic life. Panopticism is not a regional mechanics limited to certain institutions. For Bentham, panopticism really is a general political formula that characterizes a type of government The third consequence, the second being the conjunction between the disciplines and liberalism, is the appearance in this new art of government, of mechanisms, with the function of producing, breathing life into, and increasing freedom, of introducing additional freedom through additional control and intervention. This is to say, control is no longer just the necessary counterweight to freedom. As in the case of panopticism, it becomes its mainspring. And here again, we have examples of this, such as what took place in England and the United States in the 20th century. In the 1930s, say, when not only the economic, but also the political consequences of the developing economic crisis were immediately detected and seen to represent a danger to a number of what were thought to be basic freedoms. Roosevelt's welfare policy, for example, starting from 1932, was a way of guaranteeing and producing more freedom in a dangerous situation of unemployment, chômage. Freedom to work, freedom of consumption, political freedom, and so on. What was the price of this? The price was precisely a series of artificial, voluntarist interventions, of direct economic interventions in the market, represented by the basic welfare measures, and which, from 1946, and even from the start, moreover, were described as being in themselves threats of a new despotism. That's my mom in there. She's a retired nurse. Her husband is a retired accountant. And she likes to whistle at her puppies, and he likes to shout at the cats. And they both like to drink bourbon every day. But they're cool. They're okay. In this case, democratic freedoms are only guaranteed by an economic interventionism which is denounced as a threat to freedom. So we arrive, if you like, and this is also an important point to keep hold of, at the idea that in the end this liberal art of government introduces by itself, or is the victim from within of what could be called crisis of governmentality. These are crises which may be due, for example, to the increase in the economic cost of the exercise of these freedoms. Consider, for example, how in the texts of the Trilateral in recent years, there has been an attempt to project the effects of political freedom on the economic level of cost. So there is a problem, or crisis, if you like, or a consciousness of crisis, based on the definition of the economic cost of the exercise of freedom. Another form of crisis would be due to the inflation of the compensatory mechanisms of freedom. That is to say, for the exercise of some freedoms, like that of the freedom of the market and anti-monopoly legislation. For example, you could have the formation of a legislative straitjacket, which the market partners experience as excessive interventionism and excessive constraint and coercion. At a much more local level, you have everything which takes on the appearance of revolt and rejection of the world of the disciplines. Finally, and above all, there are processes of clogging such that the mechanisms for producing freedom, precisely those that are called upon to manufacture this freedom, actually produce destructive effects which prevail over the very freedom they are supposed to produce. This is, if you like, the ambiguity of all the devices which could be called liberogenic. That is to say, devices intended to produce freedom which potentially risk producing exactly the opposite. This is precisely the present crisis of liberalism. All of those mechanisms which, since the years from 1925 to 1930, have tried to offer economic and political formulae to secure states against communism, socialism, National Socialism, and fascism. All these mechanisms and guarantees of freedom which have been implemented in order to produce this additional freedom, or at any rate to react to threats to this freedom, have taken the form of economic interventions. That is to say, shackling economic practice, or any way of coercive interventions in the domain of economic practice whether German liberals of the Freiburg School from 1927 to 30, or present day so-called libertarian American liberals. In both cases, the starting point of their analysis and the cornerstone of their problem is this: mechanisms of economic intervention have been deployed to avoid the reduction of freedom that would be entailed by transition to socialism, fascism, or national socialism. But is it not the case that these mechanisms of economic intervention surreptitiously introduce types of intervention and modes of action which are as harmful to freedom as the visible and manifest political forms one wants to avoid? In other words, Keynesian kinds of intervention will be absolutely central to these different discussions. We can say that around Keynes, around the economic interventionist policy perfected between 1930 and 1960, immediately before and after the war, all these interventions have brought about what we can call a crisis of liberalism. And this crisis manifests itself in a number of re-evaluations, reappraisals, and new projects in the art of government, which were formulated immediately before and after the war in Germany, and which are presently being formulated in America. To summarize or conclude, I would like to say that if it is true that a feature of the contemporary world or of the modern world since the 18th century really has been the constant presence of phenomena of what may be called crisis of capitalism, couldn't we also say that there have been crises of liberalism, which are not, of course, independent of the crisis of capitalism? The problem of the 30s I have just been referring to is indeed the proof of this. But crises of liberalism are not just the pure and simple or direct projection of these crises of capitalism in the political sphere. You can find crisis of liberalism linked to crisis of the capitalist economy. But you can also find them with a chronological gap with regard to these crises. And in any case, the way in which these crises manifest themselves, are handled, call forth reactions, and prompt reorganizations, is not directly deducible from the crisis of capitalism. It is the crisis of the general apparatus of governmentality. And it seems to me that you could study the history of these crises, of the general apparatus of governmentality, which was installed in the 18th century. That is what I will try to do this year. But approaching things retrospectively, as it were. That is to say, I will start with the way in which the elements of this crisis, of the apparatus of governmentality, have been set out and formulated over the last 30 years. And I will try to find in the history of the 19th century some of the elements which enable us to clarify the way in which the crisis of the apparatus of governmentality is currently experienced, lived, practiced, and formulated. Okay, that's the end of lecture 3 from The Birth of Biopolitics, lectures by Michel Foucault at the College of France, 1978-79.